All right. So here we are, the Chapter 19 review guide. This is essentially powered by you guys. What I did was I took all of your pieces of all of uh, your presentations that you did, and I put it together to form a review guide. So this is 7th grade Social Studies 2015. Well done, people. So here we go, a quick review. So we're going to first talk about the Tibet-Qinghai Plateau. Why is this region referred to as the roof of the world? Well, it's because it's the highest, biggest plateau in the world. Mount Everest is there. It's the tallest part on the planet. And that's something that you want to remember. So it has the highest mountains in the world. So in terms of the people that live in the Tibet-Qinghai Plateau, they survive by keeping yaks for food. And to get heat from their fur, and they also used it for their homes and things like that. So there were also very few crops in this area. Mostly, we're talking about how they grazed yaks and things like that. So that brings us to our desert regions. We'll start with the Gobi Desert, very large desert, very few vegetation. The climate can reach up to 100 degrees. And actually probably even a little bit higher. As compared, and we'll talk about, it gets cold there too, which is something you don't think about in the desert. The last thing we'll talk about is the Gobi Desert. It's different from the Taklimakan because it has a stony surface covered with pebbles instead of sand. We usually think of deserts with sand. The Gobi Desert really is more stony and has more pebbles and rocks and things like that. So the Taklimakan Desert is a large desert as well, and it's the world's second largest shifting sand desert, which means the sand gets blown around, and really it's these sand dunes that shift all over the place. It's a paradigmatic cold desert climate, and that is nature of a paradigm or model, and that just means that it kind of doesn't really fit the idea of what a desert is. There's very little water. It's very hazardous to cross. Once you go in, you're not coming out. So that's the Taklimakan Desert. So then we get to the next piece here. We'll talk about the Northeastern plains, and we want to know what is meant by the land of the yellow earth. It's named the land of the yellow earth because the ground is covered with yellow limestone silt, and that blows in from the Gobi Desert. It's carried by the wind into the North China Plain, and that's what we're talking about here. So yeah, make sure you understand we're talking about the North China Plain. I think I said it a little different earlier, but that's okay. So remember, it carries in this silt. It goes into the Yellow River. It floods, makes the land pretty fertile, and that's why it's called the land of the yellow earth. So where is the Northeastern Plains most vulnerable to invasion? In the south, there was in the south area of the Northeastern Plains. It's a narrow strip of land that connects the plain to the rest of China. This is a path used several times as a route for invaders. We've got all those other natural physical features that are preventing people from coming, but there was a narrow strip of land that allowed invaders to come into China. So where it's at, we don't really, it is located east of present-day Mongolia, that is true. It's sometimes called Manchuria, that is true. And what we really want to talk about is the vegetation. It's prairie grass, and this provides food for grazing animals like horses and sheep, and that's how the people adapted. They had raised grazing animals, were more nomadic because of the vegetation that was found in this area. So we'll do some comparisons here. We'll talk about the Chang Basin. We might pop around a little bit, but that's okay. So we'll talk about some similarities between this basin and the Turpan Basin. And I think there's a couple of other slides that talk about this too. They both were mainly used for grazing animals, and the climate in both basins is really hot. Later on, we see that farming was developed, particularly in the Chang Basin. Because of the moist weather, they were able to raise a lot of things like rice. So when we compare these two again, let's quickly look at some of the similarities and differences that they have. The Chang Basin, really warm, fertile climate, wet and fertile. the physical features were mostly rivers. There's some mountains and forests around, so it changes a little bit. Then you've got the Turpan Basin. It's either really hot or really cold. Generally, it's warmer. The physical features are mostly mountains and some desert. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of the comparison there. So we'll shift over to the Huanghe River, and how does this river influence settlements near its bank? So this is again, how does ultimately geography and physical features influence where people live? The deposits, the silt deposits, help make the land around it very fertile. So that means when the river floods and then recedes, it leaves all the good stuff on there for vegetation to grow really well. So people would plant crops and things like that. It has mountain and deserts that were hard to cross, making it hard for intruders. So again, because of where it comes from, it's ultimately a safe place to live. So that's going to be something to think about, again, because it comes from the mountains and the deserts surround it. That makes this area really desirable for people to live. So here's our next question. So because China was so isolated, there's a couple of questions we need to think about. What made keeping China together under one government difficult in Chinese history? So we'll get into some of the political things. And one of the reasons it was so hard to govern is that it was so spread out. Okay, when you've got that much land to cover, it makes it very difficult to ultimately govern all the people there. And when travel is not very easy, how are you going to be able to tell people the rules and the laws and things like that? So it was really difficult to keep everybody unified under this one government. And that just simply means that it was really difficult to make sure that everybody was doing things like paying taxes to the government and following the rules and laws. So again, here's some of the reasons why it's hard. And, this will be a little bit redundant, but that's okay because we had a few different people that did this topic. So China's geographic features made it hard to be under one government. You can't govern people up in the plateau the same way you can down in the Chang Basin. Okay, Inner China was essentially a bit isolated. Okay, it made it difficult to really just spread around into those areas and control those areas. That narrow coastal plain connecting Inner China to the Northeastern plain, that was that area that we talked about earlier where it makes it more or less the only place that you could be, that Inner China could be attacked. But the main thing again is the geography. When it's so large and so spread out and so hard to get to some of those areas, that it was hard to keep everybody unified under one government. So that gets us to ancient China's isolation question. And what protected Inner China from being attacked from the northwest? Well, ultimately, the large deserts acted like barriers. They helped China hide from the northwest people. And that just, essentially means that it was hard for people to cross those areas. The only narrow coastal plain linked the northeastern plain to Inner China. So again, that one part up there in the northeastern plain was the only place that they could be attacked. So where did ancient China decide would be the best place to grow rice? Well, really, near those really wet areas like in the Chang Basin, and that had really fertile land. The weather was ideal. Outer China, not so much. The land wasn't great for really growing anything. And of course, you got to have a lot of water, and Outer China didn't have that. And Inner China, it was good for growing crops and raising cattle, so it really made it again desirable on why people would want to live there and do that. The river floods, makes the land fertile. All is good in the world. So here we'll do some comparisons: the North China Plain to the Chang Basin. Really, both places are decent to live, but you have to kind of choose a lifestyle. One's going to be more for farming and raising crops. One is really more for raising cattle. Both are desirable. I mean, it makes life a little bit easier when you've got a steady food source. And that's really what we're talking about here. So take a look at some of these comparisons. So then we'll talk about outer China. Really not an easy place to live because you're not able to grow crops as easily. And that's what this is all about. Areas where it's easy to live versus not easy to live. And inner China was the place to be because water, fertile land, weather was okay. And that's going to be the big difference maker on where people live. So we're talking inner China and outer China. So basically, you guys, that wraps it up. We've gone over this stuff. Hopefully you're familiar with it. We're going to move on with our study of ancient China. I love the work that you did. I'm super proud of you guys. And this is all you, so I used your info. And now it's time for you guys to review this stuff, and we will put this chapter to bed. So excellent job, and I expect to see more of this in the future. Great work, people.